Here in the United States, especially in this city, there's a perpetual debate about the rightful role of the United States in the world. Just the phrase American leadership makes some people very uneasy. For some, it evokes war and invasions, and not without reason, I'll grant. In recent years, American engagement with the world has often come in the form of military force. But we know there is an enormous space between boots on the ground and heads in the sand. At Human Rights First, when we talk about leadership on human rights, we're talking about the US government upholding its highest ideals as it plays an active and prominent and progressive force in the world. And history shows that when the US government puts its principles into practice, it can be an enormous force for good, one that bolsters human rights activists and weakens their oppressors. Conversely, when the United States falls short, the opposite happens. Tyrants take heart and activists take cover. So at Human Rights First, we seek to place human rights at the heart of US foreign policy. That means consistently using American influence to lift up those fighting for progress and to press repressive governments for reform. And it means tackling human rights problems before they become crises that spawn widespread suffering and security threats. Leadership on the world stage flows from leadership by example. So it's crucial that the United States government gets its own house in order. Several years ago, we created this Beacon Prize to recognize achievement that embodies the best tradition of American leadership on human rights. I'm really thrilled this year to be honoring a member of the judiciary. As many of you know, and some of you were there at the creation, Human Rights First was founded by a group of young lawyers who fervently believed that the rule of law is an important guarantor of human rights. And that founding vision continues to guide us today. It's a vision that this year's honoree shares. Over the course of his illustrious career on issues ranging from habeas corpus to discrimination in housing to LGBT equality, Justice Anthony Kennedy has used the law to make rights real and to broaden freedom for all Americans. You may not agree with all of his decisions, but no one can doubt his commitment to human dignity and the rule of law. Justice Kennedy will perhaps best be remembered for a series of rulings that have helped LGBT Americans live as equals under the law. In particular, this year's majestic and deeply humane majority decision legalizing same-sex marriage. Its already famous last paragraph will be read at weddings as long as there are weddings. It was deeply meaningful to me personally and to my family. I dare say that Justice Kennedy believes not just in the power of law, but in the power of love.
Law and freedom are priceless, yet they become more valuable when we enable others to share them. This is the meaning of the United States.
Justice Kennedy embodies a belief in the dignity of every individual, and his opinions reflect that both in domestic law and in international law. Justice Kennedy and I were in the same class at Harvard Law School and survived that ordeal together.
You have an oath, an obligation to defend something that is really basic to the American identity, to the American ideal.
Clearly in the Roper case, where the court prohibited capital punishment for juveniles, he showed a real respect for the opinion of the rest of the world.
Let us assume that it's an accepted practice in most countries of the world not to execute a juvenile for moral reasons. That has no bearing on whether or not what we're doing is unusual.
I think the rule of law is so strong in America. Our country's tradition, in a way, is to be a leader in that field, and should be, and that he maintains that.
The rule of law must respect the dignity, equality, and human rights of every person.
As I became interested in the interracial marriage law, I was asked to write the brief in the Supreme Court in Loving. I think it's a duty of the judges of the Supreme Court to protect people seeking liberty, which is exactly what happened in Loving and it happened in the same-sex marriage case.
He is the justice who is the author of the 3 most important gay rights decisions in the history of the Supreme Court.
Same-sex marriage, he wrote, must be allowed under the United States Constitution.
The Supreme Court's decision was really looking, I guess, at the future.
He has this magnificent phrase in the opinion about the fact that we don't know what liberty meant at the time of the Constitution in terms of modern day life, and that the Constitution is a living, breathing charter.
Democracy doesn't have a permanent life expectancy. It has to be preserved from one generation to the next.
In a way, he's a paradigm for the Beacon Prize because he fulfills what it meant to have people do, which is carry out our best traditions, the tradition of Eleanor Roosevelt and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights.
Justice Kennedy is not only one of the nation's leading jurists, but around Human Rights First, he's also known primarily as a law school classmate of the one and only Bill Zabel. As you saw in that video, Bill's active engagement in the human rights movement dates back decades, and as chairman of our board, he has exhibited bold and steady leadership. I can't tell you how great a privilege it is for me to have Bill at the helm of Human Rights First. It's really difficult to overstate what his leadership has meant to our organization. Thank you so much, Bill, for your leadership, and please come on up.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's half a century ago that a young man from California and a young man from South Dakota started our first class at Harvard Law School. And I can tell you we're both happy to be here tonight, even physically. I think Tony and I both live by the aphorism, age is a number, and ours is unlisted numbers. It's a great honor to be able to present this award to a man who does epitomize everything we think of about the right way to live and the right way to be a judge and the right way to protect the rule of law. The interpretation of our Constitution by Justice Kennedy in that opinion as being entrusted to generations as a charter protecting the right of all persons to enjoy liberty as we learn its meaning is a wise and right jurisprudence that I think will last immortally in the history of American jurisprudence because it is the correct interpretation, in my opinion, of human rights and civil rights in our society. And Tony will live in history as being a promulgator of such a great opinion and such a great career. Could you come up and receive this award?
Okay, we're going to walk right over here and take a picture.
Oh, beautiful.
And you're going to hold that because that's yours.
Oh, thank you so much. Are these my old law school notes, Bill? I don't know. President Massimino, my good friend Bill Zabel, fellow adherents to the idea and the reality of the rule of law, Thank you so very much for your gracious welcome and for your reception and for this splendid award. The award is the Beacon Award, which must remind us that it is our duty as Americans, our duty as citizens of the world, our duty as persons, our duty as human beings, to ensure that light is always cast in the darkness and in the shadows where injustice persists. Congratulations for what this magnificent association does to remind us, as this award reminds me and should remind you, that we must always rededicate ourselves to the proposition that the work of freedom is never done. It's very interesting and very important to note that your group consists of lawyers and members and supporters from many other disciplines and backgrounds. My wife Mary was a teacher, and in the third grade they had once every year a day when the fathers or the mothers would come in and say what their job was. And so I went to say, I'm Judge Kennedy on the Ninth Circuit. So I gave the kids a little lecture, and then I would have them write me a note. And I'd talk to them a little bit about the Constitution. So the note came back, and it said, "This was a very important lecture. I learned that there are 3 parts of government: lawyers, judges, and attorneys." I like. But the Constitution isn't just for lawyers and judges. It's yours. It's all of ours. In the practice of law, one of the biographies I've been reading recently is of Gandhi. He was a wonderful lawyer. And he said the duty of the lawyer is to unite parties who've been driven asunder. And in my practice, unless we were able to settle a case, I can't say that this happened often. But in the world of public law, in the world of defining and defending and preserving and enriching and respecting human rights, we can unite, all of us for different disciplines. Thoreau wrote Civil Disobedience, and that influenced Gandhi, the attorney. Gandhi then wrote, and that influenced Martin Luther King, a non-attorney. And Martin Luther King, letters from Birmingham jail and other writings, influenced Mandela, an attorney. So you have philosophers, thinkers, and attorneys working together. Mandela said, when we throw off our chains to find freedom, our next job is to live in a way that respects and enriches the freedom of others. And that's the purpose of your association. And that's our common commitment. The Constitution is a word we usually spell with a big C, capital C. That's the Constitution of the United States. We were talking at dinner about the fact that we're from many different backgrounds, ethnicities, religions, nationalities, but we're united by this thing called the Constitution. It's our self-identity. It's who we are. And so when we think of the Constitution, we usually think of the Constitution with the big C. The Constitution was drafted in the hot summer of 1787, ratified in 1789. Bill of Rights was added to it in 1791. But Constitution also has another meaning with a small c. And this is a word, constitution, that was used by political theorists from early times, Hobbes, Locke, Rousseau, but beyond that, Aristotle, beyond that, Plato, and later Jacques Maritain and Harrington. Constitution with a small c to mean the sum total of traditions, customs, mores, principles, virtues that define a culture, that define a civilization. And when the rest of the world looks at America, and much of the rest of the world does look at America because the verdict of freedom is still out. Half the world is still wondering whether they should vote for freedom. And when they look at the United States, they see the small c Constitution. And our small c Constitution must include a civic discourse, a civic tradition, a history, a heritage, an ongoing commitment to a dialogue and a conversation that's decent and rational and respectful and enviable for showing the respect we have for each other as humans. And we must work on this small c Constitution. We must work on this civic dialogue. That's the way that's the principal object of scrutiny and examination, and we hope of teaching that the rest of the world looks at. Now, the big Constitution and the small c Constitutions, they'd come together. But this small c Constitution, the conversations we have, the debates we have, the civic discourse we have, the ability we have to recognize that one of the purposes of freedom is to plan our destiny. Not long ago, my granddaughter is a ballet dancer, and we were at Chautauqua, and they had some for her ballet performance. But they had a thing going on about Greek history. So they said, well, you're on this panel to talk about ancient Greece. So, you know, we know about everything on the Supreme Court. So, I didn't know what to say. So one of the questions I had was, would Greek, and the Greek we were talking about, ancient Greece, Athens, Periclean Athens, 500 BC, close enough for government work. And so I asked the question, would the Greeks think we were free? And would we think the Greeks were free? Taking the first, I said, now in case anybody from the National Enquirer is here, I know slavery, men only, I know that. What would the Greeks think we were free? The Greeks took an oath, the Athenians, when they became of age of citizenship, which was 18. And it's a beautiful oath in Greek. And it said, we swear and we commit, and we undertake and we promise that we will engage in civic affairs to the end that Athens will be more beautiful, more safe, and more free for our successors than it is for us. They thought freedom was the capacity to plan your destiny and the duty to engage in a rational, decent discourse to explain the values of your people to the rest of the world. Athens failed because it did not obey its oath, was not faithful to its oath. And this must not happen to us. And we must remember, we were talking at the dinner table, you don't take a DNA test to see if you believe in freedom or human rights. It's taught. It's taught. 3 years ago, the State Department asked me to please go to Western Europe. We've spent a number of years in Austria at the University of Salzburg because there are some serious problems in the judiciaries in some of the countries of Eastern Europe. And so the conference agenda that was put in place at my request was to have, we had 7 U.S. ambassadors to the Eastern and Central European countries. And we met in Vienna. And I asked each ambassador to bring one judge from their country whom they respected most, so it would be a small group. And the purpose of our discussion was our concern that the judiciaries in many of these countries were being subject to tremendous political pressures, including by some of the chief justices who did not understand judicial independence. Years ago, as a young person, I thought what we would do is we go to a country and say, oh, here's democracy, you're free, goodbye. It doesn't work that way. And after this meeting, there were a number of judges, maybe 100 judges. And a young woman stood up from an Eastern European country, and she said, there are 2 tragedies in my country. One is that the rule of law is slipping away. The other is that many understand it, but few seem to care. We must care about the rule of law. We must care and teach the meaning of human rights, which is the heritage of freedom. Thank you very much.